Prime Minister Mark Carney is among the many world leaders coming out in defense of Greenland today as U.S. President Donald Trump threatens to acquire it. European allies are also pushing back, saying in a joint statement Greenland belongs to its people and only Denmark and Greenland can decide on matters concerning their relations. Just over an hour ago, I spoke to Greenland Member of Parliament Pele Broberg. He is the leader of the opposition Nalarak Party. Pelle Broberg, it's good to meet you. Thank you for being here today, sir.
My pleasure, and thank you for having me.
How seriously are you and other members of your parliament taking these latest threats from U.S. President Donald Trump, or musings from U.S. President Donald Trump, that Greenland should belong to the U.S.?
Well, I think we are looking at it a little bit differently than most other countries are doing, because you have to remember this isn't new. This started in 2019, where Trump wanted to buy Greenland. He kind of figured out immediately that that couldn't be the case. But in the second round here, I think most people are too eager to put words in his mouth and actually interpret what he's saying instead of listening to him. Because people tend to forget that we actually signed an agreement with the US in 2020 saying that we are vital for the defense of the US continent. So basically, he's not saying anything we haven't signed with the US already. But what people are putting into it is completely different. And that's where you see this fear-mongering, this panic of what is he going to do? Well, if you look at the latest he has said, along with what his special envoy has said, is that what they're actually talking about is empowering the Greenlandic people and offering, for instance, a free association forum, which means independence from Denmark for Greenland. That doesn't mean we should belong to the US, but again, it's a big difference between what the press is focusing on and what we are hearing.
Okay, but did you hear what his Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, had to say yesterday? He said it's their view that Greenland should belong to the U.S. He said nobody is going to fight the U.S. militarily over the future of Greenland. Mm-hmm. And then he said we live in a world, in the real world, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. And these are the iron laws of the world since the beginning of time. That sure sounds like more than just an association. That sounds like annexation.
Well, if we want to promote him to President of the United States, then I have to say, well, the day before that, it was his wife that somebody promoted to the President of the United States. He is not, and neither is his wife. So let's dial down the rhetoric. And one of the important things you have to remember is that everybody seems so keen on talking about the annexation from the US as a threat, completely ignoring that we have been annexed by Denmark. And that's why we're trying to get independence as well. So I don't see how the world society is trying to uphold the international rule-based world when they at the same time disregard how Denmark annexed Greenland in the first place. So no, from my point of view, I'm looking for possibilities and options. I'm not looking to make an enemy out of the United States, because that's neither to the benefit of NATO, European Union, or the US. So right now, instead of using Greenland as a punching bag between the US and everybody that seem to not like the US, I think people should back off Greenland and say, well, let the Greenlanders talk to the US and let them figure out what they want, instead of saying, why aren't you afraid of the US?
Well, well, with respect, I mean, that's not what I'm asking, I guess, is we don't know what their intentions are. You know, we have had, in my lifetime, referendums on Quebec separating from Canada, and that is a choice for Quebecers to make and Canada to deal with in a legal form, as they have rules around their territorial integrity. And I think that is certainly the position of most other countries, that what happens with Greenland is up to the people of Greenland, the people of Denmark, to decide on their own, through whatever mechanism exists in your laws. But they are talking about, in their national security strategy, of a dominance of the hemisphere, and saying, the president on Air Force One, that they're going to have more to say about Greenland in like 20 days, and that they would like your territory. So you see no sort of menace in that whatsoever from the President of the United States.
No.
That's interesting.
Yeah, but you have to, again, remember, what you're talking about is two different things. It's not the territory that is important, it's the people. A
Hmm.
territory is never granted any powers by international law, it's the people. So again, I'll repeat it once more. Why doesn't everybody just back up of the for the Greenlandic people to have a dialogue with the US
Hmm.
without the press present? Excuse me for saying it that bluntly, but because the press doesn't seem to help at this point. You only seem to make it worse by creating a conflict where there is none, because everybody is speculating. Right now, what I heard from you before was that, well, Stephen Miller says something. Well, Donald Trump, who is the president of the United States, has already said that it's up to the Greenlandic people to decide what we want to do. And what we actually need to do right now is have a dialogue between Greenland and the US without Denmark or
Right.
anybody else present to figure out what is it they want to do. We're not even there yet because everybody is talking about annexation and NATO is falling apart and all that, instead of actually saying, well, let the Greenlanders decide what they want to do, and then we'll take it from there. If we come running out from that meeting screaming help, that's a completely different matter. But we're not even there yet.
I
We
hear.
have seen our government for a year now try the Danish tactic of writing Facebook posts and saying, don't call us this and don't say that. That just doesn't work. That's not a mature way to run a country. So, what we're proposing is what we've done since 2019 and saying, well, let's have an adult conversation with the US and say, what is it that makes them nervous? And what can we do to alleviate those concerns? Because you have to remember, the Danish prime minister back in 2018 told the US that Greenland was for sale and that Denmark intervened in the airport projects to keep China out. That's the
Right.
narrative that the Danes used. So right now, of course, everybody in the US thinks we are for sale and that China is knocking on our door and that we might be willing to sell our country to the Chinese. Well, no, that's not the case, but that's a narrative that Danes themselves has created.
Right.
So
Look,
we need to have an adult conversation.
I sorry to interrupt you, but as we're having this conversation, the White House has issued a statement. They say the issue of the U.S. acquisition of Greenland is not going away. Trump is eager for a deal despite objections from NATO leaders. Trump has made clear that acquiring Greenland is a national security priority. And Trump and his team are discussing a range of options for acquiring Greenland. And this is a direct quote, utilizing the U.S. military is always an option. So this is from the White House. This is an official statement from the White House that using the military, so this is presumably vetted and approved by the president himself. So look, I don't want you going into meetings and running out screaming help, Mr. Broberg. I promise I do not wish that on your future. But when they say utilizing the U.S. military is always an option, how do you view that?
Why shouldn't they say that? You have to remember, people are so busy trying to put the US in a specific position to negotiate with or against them. And that way you can't take them for granted. And that's why I keep telling everybody that we need to have an adult conversation with them. And you have to remember, as he said, he wants to do a deal. We want independence. They want security. Well, is there anything to gain from both of us? Yeah, probably, but we won't find out until we have a conversation with them, and that can't be through the press nor Facebook.
No, I appreciate that. And just as a final question, you want to have a conversation with them. You know, if you can achieve independence and negotiate some sort of an alliance or alignment with the United States, it seems to be your preferred path as a politician. But based on what you've seen in the less than a year, President Trump has been back in his second term. How do you think a negotiation with the U.S. would go for you? Because we're in the middle of one-on-one trade, the world is in the middle of one, and it's not going very well. I just wonder how you think it would go for Greenland.
Well, I will never tell you how I think it would go because I can guarantee you something would spoil that negotiation, and especially from the Danes. But again, if you look at how everybody has said the last year, that Trump was going to annex Greenland, it's going to be the military. How many years will we hear about the military just because they say they will never rule out using the military when they want to secure their own safety? So again, This is not a matter of attacking the Greenlandic people. That's what they always have said. And it's not a matter of attacking NATO members, even though the Danes wanted to sound like that because they want to keep us. It's a matter of saying to the Chinese and Russians and everybody else the US doesn't want, in, according to the Monroe Doctrine, in their hemisphere, saying stay away from Greenland because we won't hold back if it comes to that. So again,
Right.
and all the politicians before Trump, and even during the first term with Trump, said we want a defense agreement with the US in case of our independence. So that hasn't changed. So again, the deal is there to be made. It's just a matter if there's any adults in the room to do that deal.
Pele Broberg, Greenland MP, thank you so much for your time. I know you're traveling. I know it's late. Thank you for joining us, and try to get some sleep. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so in that interview, I read the new White House statement that we've just received, which confirms the U.S. aspirations for Greenland. I just want to read it to you again. President Trump has made it well known that acquiring Greenland is a national security priority of the United States, and it's vital to deter our adversaries in the Arctic region. The president and his team are discussing a range of options to pursue this important foreign policy goal, and of course, utilizing the U.S. military is always an option at the commander-in-chief's disposal. So, what does this mean for the European countries who earlier today said they will not stop defending sovereignty and territorial integrity? Well, Tjorven Bellmann is the German ambassador to Canada, and she joins me now. Ambassador, it's good to see you again. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me back.
I wonder what your reaction is to that White House statement. Acquiring Greenland is a national security priority, and using the military is always an option. I know your foreign minister had some reaction to this earlier this week, but this seems to move it a bit further.
Yeah, I think the German government, Chancellor Friedrich Merz and Foreign Minister Wadefuhl, have been very clear regarding our position that Greenland belongs to its people and it's for the Kingdom of Denmark and Greenland to decide on matters of the Kingdom of Denmark and Greenland, and only them and no others. At the same time, Arctic security, of course, is a high priority for us, as it is for Canada, as it is for the Kingdom of Denmark. I mean, Denmark now is, I think, at 3.3% defense spending. Since last year, they have invested around 19 billion Canadian dollars in capabilities that can either be used in the Arctic or are directly in the Arctic. For a country of 6 million, that's quite a significant number. The US already has a base, a Pacific space base in Greenland, what used to be Thule Air Base. If there is, there's the defense treaty between the US and the Kingdom of Denmark. So if there is any lack in capabilities or lack in military posture that the US wants to address, our position is that NATO is the right place to have this discussion. And I'm sure the Danish government is very interested in resolving this issue in a way that is based on facts and that addresses our common goal, which is deterring our aggressors and keeping the Arctic safe.
The Danish Prime Minister met with Prime Minister Carney today. She said a U.S. attack on Greenland, which is something that's, it's amazing to have to contemplate based on the statements we've seen. But she said this would mean the end of NATO. I mean, what is your view that this rhetoric from the U.S., what is this doing to the NATO alliance, of which Germany is obviously a key member?
I mean, you can see that the Danish government, and understandably, obviously, is very worried. I think what we should focus now and what we are concentrating on is trying to have a conversation around the issues based on facts. So Arctic security is a common goal of all of us. If there is any gaps that we need to address, this is what we should be focusing on. And NATO is the right place to have this conversation. Greenland clearly is part of the area of operations of the Supreme Allied Commander. So let's sit down and have the conversation.
There is this push, though, just coming from the U.S. We look at what the White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, said yesterday, that we live in a world that is governed by strength and that is governed by force and that is governed by power. And look, the U.S. is at the top of the power rankings, when it comes to the global order. So I don't even know if this is might makes right so much as might makes possible. I mean, how do countries like Canada and Germany and others sort of confront that, resist that?
I think we have to continue to engage and explain what we are doing, like Canada is doing in terms of defense investment here, or in terms of the trade piece, and we are doing in terms of all the investments we are doing. You can see, for example, today at the Ukraine conference in Paris, how there was a process where Europeans and Canadians engaged heavily with the US on issues that concern us, and we managed to make progress in terms of security guarantees and other issues. So we need to focus on the issues, sit down and engage and try to channel these issues into processes where we address what's at stake and what are our common goals. But at the same time, be very clear that territorial integrity and sovereignty of nations is not something that should be put into question, certainly not by our most important allies.
But yet here we are, right? It is. You have to remind yourself this is actually happening, and you at a time we would maybe dismiss this as musings, but then they laid it all out sort of in the national security strategy that the government of the United States published in November, and it's almost like an action plan for many of the things that they're saying out loud. And you reference Paris, and there is this alignment on a security guarantee should there be a peace agreement that relies heavily on U.S. backing. How do we calibrate what they're saying about Greenland with what they're promising to the European partners when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, if you see the Ukraine piece, I mean, the US now has committed to quite extensive and legally binding security guarantees. So I think in that file we really did make progress and have made progress. And of course, it all depends on the Russians ending this war. And the work we've done is important, but in the end, it is up to the Russians to end this war, and they could end it today if they wanted to. So we will have to see, and we haven't seen any enthusiasm on the Russian side, any readiness to end this war. In terms of Arctic security, what we are doing is, we procure our submarines from an Arctic nation, Norway, and we very deliberately build and maintain them together. We would, by the way, invite Canada to join this club and build with us the biggest conventional submarine fleet around the same boat on the globe. We try to do more in the Arctic. We've had the FGS Berlin in August in Nuuk. We took part in Arctic Light and a military exercise in Greenland in September. And of course, we have a maritime security partnership that encompasses Canada, Denmark, and Norway, where we do a lot of work around anti-submarine warfare. So I think we have to up our own defenses and invest in our strategic capabilities, as both of our countries are doing. We have to engage the US on the security concerns that they might have, but make very clear that we have to find a solution that doesn't put into question the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the Kingdom of Denmark and of Greenland.
But how do we reconcile those things, just as a final point, right? Because you're right on the need to cooperate and work on these things, and we talk about Arctic security, at least until this point, on the challenges coming from Russia and China and other bad actors globally. But now the U.S. has barged into this with its territorial ambitions, which sort of threatens that Arctic security and cooperation process that all of these nations were going through. So, I guess can you move ahead with trust with the United States, with what we're seeing each and every day from this administration?
I think we have no choice but to try to engage and re-engage and to rebuild this trust. And be very, lucid around the implications of that. But I find it more helpful to concentrate on the issues and try to address those instead of speculating about theoretical developments that could happen. It doesn't mean we are naive, but I think our job as policymakers and as diplomats is to try and solve the issues at hand in a way that doesn't implicate the unity of NATO or the territorial integrity or sovereignty of our allies.
Okay, fair point to end on. Thank you so much. Tjorven Bellmann is the German ambassador to Canada. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.